Hi everyone, I'm Eshaan M, a kid's first film critic from Houston, Texas. Today, I'm speaking with some of the creatives behind DreamWorks Madagascar A Little Wild, Gloria's Got 'Em All. Johanna Stein serves as executive producer for Madagascar A Little Wild, TJ Sullivan served as supervising director, Justin Maurer served as an ASL consultant for the film, alongside Delbert and Jevon Whetter. Welcome to the festival. To get started, I'd love to know something unique about each of our panelists. So let's go around and start with Joanna.
Oh, hi everybody. Something unique about me. I'm in Winnipeg, Canada right now. I don't know if that's completely unique. There's about 600,000 of us, but it's interesting.
Wonderful. And let's go to Justin.
Sure. The first thing that came to mind is I'm currently in East Hollywood, which is the only neighborhood in LA with three official names: Little Armenia, Thai Town, and East Hollywood. So there's three official names, and that's where I am.
Wow, I did not know that. Very interesting. Alrighty, TJ.
I'm a giant Star Trek nerd. I'm a giant Trekkie.
Aren't we all inside?
Yeah.
And on to Jevon.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm out here in LA, and I look forward to this wonderful discussion.
And Delbert.
Hello, everyone. One interesting fact about myself, and it could be that I come from a deaf family, and my brother Jevon is here. He's also deaf, and we come from three generations of deafness, which includes our grandparents, our parents, our aunts and uncles and cousins. So everyone in our family are deaf for three generations.
Wow. And we do have interpreters here speaking for our deaf participants, Delbert and Jevon. Their voices are our ASL interpreter, Billy Sanders and Gabe Gomez. Alrighty, so let's jump into some questions. Starting off with Joanna. So as executive producer of the show, why did you feel it was important to create a series like Madagascar A Little Wild for young people?
That's a great question. And I'm going to start by saying that as the executive producer, I have a massive team of people who works on this show. I mean, if you love to work with people and collaborate with people, animation is the way to do it. So one of the people who I collaborate with and have been working with actually is the person who did develop the show. Her name's Dana Starfield, and I was brought in to work with her and DreamWorks on this show. And the idea was to reintroduce the world of the Madagascar movies and those characters who we all love to, a new generation of viewers, and to explore what those characters were like as kids in New York City. So that's, and we knew that, we knew how funny they were, and we just wanted to explore a whole bunch of fun new shenanigans with those characters.
The episode we're screening at the festival includes the concept of critter cards. And as someone who's grown up with Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, now Magic the Gathering, all these different card games, I think for me, really, card games are a big part of my childhood. And so I'm pretty interested in learning more about where the idea for these critter cards came from.
Yes, cool. A very good question. So among the people that I get to work with on Madagascar is we have this very small but mighty writer's room. And so one of the things we would talk about ideas constantly about things we loved as kids and things that were exciting to us and things we still love, by the way. And one of our writers, her name is Sam Bissonette, is a Pokemon card shark. She was and is a great collector and player. And she actually was the writer of the episode that you are going to see, or you did just see. The episode we're talking about today.
Wonderful.
I have to say, I'm more of I like to play war. That's my card game.
And why did you include a deaf character in the episode? What was the intent behind that?
Well, if you know the Madagascar movies, you know that there are a couple of, not the regular characters, but there are two characters, Phil and Mason, and they, or one of them communicates with ASL anyway. So they became sort of the models of our two characters, Dave and Pickles. Dave is deaf, and Pickles is his sister, and yeah, that's who they were based on. But we definitely moved away from the idea of those two characters. Again, Dana Starfield decided there weren't a lot of girl characters in the movie, so she made one of the chimps a girl, and we named her Pickles. And the rest is history, or I guess the rest is our series.
And TJ, so as supervising director of the show, in creating a deaf character, what did you learn about the deaf community that you were unaware of before?
That's a really interesting question. I feel like I learned something each time we sat down to have a session. And it was always so much fun working with the team. But I think what was most interesting was learning how much facial expressions played a part and how important they were to the overall language. And we really tried to make sure that our characters not only correctly conveyed what they were trying to say with their hands, but also with, trying to sell it with their facial expressions.
And back to Johanna now. I'm really curious as to, where the idea for some of the different plot twists and, the interesting, plot points in each of the episodes came from. Did you enter the show with anything in mind that you really wanted to incorporate?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, so when we first started to work on the show, we met as writers, and actually a lot of the people who worked on our show, we would have these conversations about what shows did you love when you were a kid, and what we would really talk about what had an impact, maybe what you thought was the most funny, or something that made you change the way you think about things. And we would put all of these themes up on a board, and that's really, for the most part, that's where we started with was what's a really, I would call it like a yummy, a delicious idea that we could come up with the story for. And then we would talk about what would be so funny to see, what's a really fun visual thing to see, especially knowing that we have the city of New York. And then we would talk about, well, these characters are so visually funny, like Melman, has that crazy long neck, and we would say, what shenanigans can we get him into and exploit that big neck? And then we had music in the show, so we would talk about, wow, what's an interesting way to, type of music that we want to play with. Like, well, I don't want to say anything that hasn't been aired yet, but anyway, we have some cool musical stuff happening in the future. So I would say from all over, really, but every one of these conversations honestly started off with, ooh, what's super exciting that we can do in one of these areas. So just so that it's always fresh for us as we're creating these episodes as a team, we kind of trusted that it would be interesting and exciting for the viewers.
I like, getting a process, like, an insight into the process that goes behind each of these episodes and, behind the show. So it's really valuable to me, and I really enjoyed that answer. Thank you.
Welcome.
Alrighty, now going to Justin. So you're one of the ASL consultants on the show. So tell me a little bit more about what your role requires while working on an animated series like this.
Sure. So I grew up with a deaf mom, a deaf stepdad, and a deaf aunt. So I'm called a CODA, a child of a deaf adult. That's what it stands for. And some folks might recognize the film that is out right now that just received 3 Oscar nominations with the same title. And so basically, when I got involved, I wanted to bring on Delbert Whetter immediately because I knew Delbert had a background in animation. And Delbert wanted to bring on his brother immediately because Jevon has a history of acting on the stage in ASL. And so really to get the ASL from, you have the English in script. So the English in script, other way around. Now I'm talking in ASL word order. The script is written in a language called English, and it has to be translated into American Sign Language. And so American Sign Language doesn't have the same grammatical structure as English does. And so because Jevon had written and directed a lot of plays and has been extensively involved in film as well. And the deaf theater has a very rich tradition of adapting plays in English to work on stage in American Sign Language. And so that was another reason why Jevon was such an integral part of our team. But basically, the first step is to look at the lines, how they're written in English, and translate them to ASL. And so some jokes or idioms in English don't work in ASL, just like they don't work in other languages. So we had to figure out how to choose signs that would be punchy, short, concise, and easy to animate, but also keep in mind our audience, which is young children. And so how would young children sign this? And so you have two characters who use sign language, who are the chimps. One is Dave, who is deaf, and one is Pickles, who is his sister. And so Pickles acts as the SODA, the acronym for sibling of a deaf adult. And so Pickles is there to make sure Dave is actively involved in the conversation and isn't just a passive one-dimensional character. Dave is a three-dimensional character that has his own personality, and Pickles is there to make sure he's involved in the conversation and is also interpreting for him, often simultaneously. And so our process basically was, first off, to translate the English to ASL. Secondly, to film ASL reference videos to send to the animators. And then to give feedback based on the different stages of animation. And so Delbert has over 20 years experience in animation, and Jevon has, I don't know, 100 years experience in acting. He's the older brother. And so, you know, we all work together to make it happen. And hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, just like translating English, a script in English to any other language, it requires a lot of TLC. You have a lot of different choices, and you know, you have to make the right choices based on the character, their intent, and how their character would sign it in ASL. And so it's not an easy job, but it was amazing. And TJ and Johanna and their team just really were amazing, and that they used most of our notes, which never happens with consultants. So we're really grateful. And especially the episode we're talking about has Shaylee, a deaf actress. And so basically the animation is based off of a real deaf actress. So this is one of the first times there's been sign over rather than voiceover. And it was, it's an incredible episode that's one of our favorites.
That's so interesting. I like that your role almost has a scientific and also a creative element to it, right? It's like you're combining two different things. And I mean, I've just gotten into linguistics recently, and it's super interesting to, you know, be translating between languages, like what you said about idioms and things like that. So yeah, that's a very interesting role, and we're super lucky to have several ASL consultants on the call with us today. And now moving to another ASL consultant, Delbert. So you are also an ASL consultant on the show. And why is the issue of deaf representation in media important to you?
This is Delbert speaking. So it's extremely important for disabilities in general, because 1 out of 5 people in the United States has a disability, but we don't see that many characters on television or in film. There's about less than 2% of characters on TV and film are portrayed as having a disability. So a big part of that ignorance and that stereotyping and discrimination actually comes from that ignorance itself, is people don't consider disabilities. They don't even consider putting this disability on screen because maybe they don't interact with people with disabilities in their own lives. And so a lot of discrimination and stereotyping happens based on that. And so if you see people that are a part of that marginalized community, it's a bit hard to have that connection and that empathy and compassion with them if you don't personally interact with them. So that's why it's so important to have increased portrayal of deaf people and others with disability on screen, to begin to recognize that we are all the same. We are all human, just we may communicate in different ways. We may move in different ways, but basically we're all human. And that plays an important role in Hollywood, because Hollywood has a responsibility to portray more disabled people on screen.
They certainly do, and that's such a nice message. You know, we're all united by our common humanity, and it's, you know, nothing is dividing us. You know, and even seeing people as being differently abled is not the right way of seeing it. You know, we're all unique, and we're all especially when we're all the same. And that's wonderful. And I think definitely this past year and the past several years have been great to see more deaf representation in media. And it's great to see people of different backgrounds on screen and telling very unique stories. All right, now to Jevon. So what were some hurdles that you as an ASL consultant had to overcome in creating the show?
Honestly, one of the big things that came up in our process was prior to us going in person. We had to look at different perspectives of how we were portraying what we've seen. This was 2 years ago.
Up through the 6th season.
Up to the 6th season. And with that, this is before COVID hit. And when COVID hit, they put us all in isolation. We all had to upgrade how we communicated, whether it was Zoom, we're on just many different platforms and trying to see what worked for all of us. Because this is a visual language. And that was one of the biggest challenges for us to adjust as a team. And for the artists to get it, for us to get the angles correct, that type of perspective, that type of consultation. Because it's one thing that you want to see what you want to see, but we have to make sure that what we're conveying in sign and in animation was visible, and to give it just a different angle, to get the complexity and the beauty of our language. Because sometimes when characters are looking at each other, you don't see what they're signing. They had to be angled in a way where we had to give options. And I really appreciate being a part of that process. So I'm thankful for that experience. I mean, we not only met the challenge, but we beat the challenge. So I enjoyed working with this team. A lot of hard work, a lot of long nights. And just supporting each other is just something I'm going to continue to cherish. I mean, really, this has been a wonderful and rich experience for each and every one of us. Not to speak for everyone, but yeah.
Thank you for that. All right, now to TJ. What was the most gratifying part of working on the show for you?
Aside from working with a wonderful team, I gotta say it was probably seeing such a positive response from the community in general for what we've been trying to put out there. Like we've worked really hard with the team to really try and represent the community well, and the way that we've seen it received, not only from the deaf community, but also just from fans, has really been wonderful. Especially with these characters, where we're not highlighting that they communicate differently. They're with our children, they're with our kids on the show, and they're all together, just communicating, and it's great to see that in everyday life. And our kids are watching, just kids with different abilities all hanging out together. So it's been great to see that response.
Definitely, and I can tell from everyone's responses that, oh, sorry, I'll let Jevon go.
Okay. Well, if you don't mind, if I may add, what I thought was imperative for you all to know is that disability, there's not only one disability, right? You think about our language, our culture, the language being ASL and deaf culture. Often we wanted to include all of that. And in this film, for example, when with one song, one person may look at it and say, how do you know that person is signing that? If I'm getting someone's attention, people typically yell, but what if for us, you have to tap us on the shoulder. We had to be a little more, on the lines of integrity on how we convey, how we communicate in the cross-cultural communication.
Certainly. And I think that the consultant team, the ASL consultants, y'all have all done an amazing job of ensuring that the community has been portrayed, wonderfully, accurately, and equitably on screen. I really enjoyed the episode because it was so unique and so novel to actually see deaf representation in a mainstream media work. It was so nice to see it in a DreamWorks production as well, because I'm a massive DreamWorks fan. Alrighty, and now to Justin. The team seems extremely close. From all of y'all's responses, it seems like you've really bonded quite a bit over the experience. And I mean, you all had such a great rapport. So, reflecting on the whole process, what's been some of the most fun that you've had working on this?
I remember in the very beginning, we were going into the office over at DreamWorks in Glendale. And so Jevon would portray Dave, the deaf chimp, and they put a big D on his chest in duct tape. And I was Pickles, and they put a big P on my chest in duct tape, but a P can kind of look like a D if you don't extend the bottom thing. So it became this exaggerated duct tape on my chest. And that was a lot of fun going back and forth in the office and really kind of playing these characters. I mean, Jevon became Dave and I became Pickles, and I'm an interpreter as my day job. So it was really, and having deaf family members, it was easy for me to imagine how Pickles would react or how Pickles would be annoyed with Dave or be sick of Dave or, really want to get away from Dave, and how Dave was, Jevon's personality really is there. So when you see the animations of Dave, it's just like I see Jevon every time, whether Dave is hanging upside down, whether Dave and Pickles are having an argument about creative control of their play. And I actually worked on Jevon with the play, and so that was hilarious to see that, and not to dish any gossip about the Whetter brothers, but they are brothers, and there is a brotherly rivalry. So a big entertaining part for me was seeing the brothers actually argue about notes, which was as hilarious as the dialogue written in the show.
Oh, that's amazing. So
if I could say one more thing,
Sure.
I think it was also really wonderful to play with this team in the room when we were trying to come up with other ways of trying to communicate a gag or a joke. Because as Justin said earlier, often what's written on the page might not translate so well, with ASL. So we would try and figure out the best way to do it. Some of the most fun we had was improv and bouncing ideas off of these guys to come up with something really funny. And man, I can't tell you how many times that we were just rolling on the floor laughing with some ideas that the guys would come up with.
How many times did Jevon simulate eating a banana?
Right.
So Johanna, you've worked on a lot of other, large budget, high production value, projects, including with Netflix and DreamWorks. And what makes this show unique for you?
Well, a lot of things. I think the biggest thing for me, I love this show so much. It's been so fun to work on it. But I'll say that this is the first animated show that I'm executive producing. So and one thing about, I think I mentioned earlier, as an executive producer, I get to work with almost everybody on the show. Everyone's working very hard in their own departments, but I get to kind of skip around and collaborate with everybody. And I love that so much. But another thing that I realize is how much I've learned. I mean, especially with this team right here. I mean, I feel like I'm back in school again, except nobody's grading me. So it's the best part about being in school is I'm getting to learn so much. I remember the first time, I think that we met with Justin, Del, and Jevon for the first time we were figuring out if we were going to be working together. And we were talking about, I'm very ignorant about a lot of things in the world, and deafness is one of the things that I was very ignorant about. And I just remember the realizations that were coming to me creatively about how fun it was going to be to represent this pair of siblings, and how chimps have four they have two hands and two prehensile feet, and just the fact that, oh my gosh, they can sign with their feet, and it just became so exciting, this learning about all of the ways that we could play with ASL and the dynamic between those two. So that's a long way of saying that it's just been a really fun, educational, mind-blowing experience for me.
I love that. I think it really has been. Oh yeah, sure, go ahead.
This is Delbert, if I can chime in. It's just been amazing that there's been such authenticity and such an authentic perspective involved in the creative process, because you get things and certain nuances that you can't find anywhere else from a person who has that lived experience themselves. And so one example was just put out there, but ASL, you can use ASL underwater, for example. You can use ASL from across the room or from a long distance. In a noisy atmosphere, you could continue smoothly communicating in ASL. So if there's someone who isn't from that lived experience, maybe they wouldn't be able to think of nuances like that.
And that would be applicable in a show that's set in the wild too, right? With, you know, underwater and everything like that.
And if I could add something, yes, absolutely. I think it was very important that, and integral, that this was a deaf-led consulting team. I think oftentimes in the past when Hollywood and animated or live action has gotten it wrong, it's when they bring in someone who isn't deaf. Because you can't talk about a marginalized community without having members of that community in the room when you're having that conversation. It looks wrong, it feels wrong, and it is wrong. So the fact that we had two members of the deaf community who have that lived experience, we were, like Delbert said, able to really nail those nuances. And that's why, especially when you see this episode with Shaylee Mansfield, it just feels right, it looks right. I mentioned this in another panel, but Shaylee's brother in the show acts as her interpreter in a certain amount of scenes. And it was so authentic and so touching in a way, because, you know, I've been watching, you know, TV my whole life, and I've never seen a sibling of a deaf child interpreting for them on screen. I just haven't seen it. And so I think there's really like a very high bar being set by this show, and the standard of quality is just is amazing. It's up there. And I think with these two deaf brothers, that's the reason why it's so authentic and it feels so right, because we were able to hit those nuances.
It all comes down to the team, I think, at the end, yeah. Alrighty, and this is for TJ. What do you hope that our audiences in Hawaii and elsewhere will take away from watching the show?
I hope it'll inspire other deaf actors and filmmakers to get out there and get into the industry. You know, I think that would be great to see more representation out there.
And what about you, Johanna?
I think you know, this episode or the whole show?
Let's do the whole show. Why not?
The whole show. One thing that we talked about a lot as a team is empathy. Just being able to understand other people and to be open to people who are different. I mean, really, that's what I hope, because I think that's, you know, we with this episode, with all of our episodes, really, diversity, inclusion, representation, those things really just kept coming up. We're all so different in so many ways. So I would hope that viewers would take that away from this, and that they might, I'll end there. I'll end there.
And I'd love to hear from Delbert as well. What do you hope that audiences from the deaf community will take away from the show?
One thing that I mention quite often is I've been a consultant on many different TV and film projects. And quite often my goal is to put myself out of business as a consultant as quickly as possible. Really, that is my long-term goal, is really to create opportunities for deaf people out there to be involved as writers, as directors, as producers, as actors. And so from my experience, you know, the less need for a person like me to be involved as a consultant is my long-term goal. I want both deaf people to see that there's a lot of opportunities waiting for them to become involved in. And I also want Hollywood to see that there's a lot of deaf talent and disabled people out there with a lot of talent who are ready to work. And so there is quite a bit of disabled talent out there.
Thank you all so much for your answers. We have some festival participants also joining us at this live streaming event. So let's take some questions from our audience members. I'm sure they'll have a lot. It's been so interesting just hearing your perspectives on the show. I really, really enjoyed it. Alrighty, we have a question from Allison. She says, I just love this show. I didn't know anything about it until today. I wonder if you see the idea of including deaf characters in future shows. Are any of you working on any shows that do that? I think we can just throw this out there. Why not? Why don't we start with Justin?
Sure. I guess just this year, we've seen A Quiet Place 1 and 2 with the deaf actor. We've seen Marvel's The Eternals with the first deaf superhero. We've seen a movie like Coda with 3 deaf actors. And we've seen animated shows by almost every network that include sign language in some way, especially I think in education for children. As you know, children are able to sign before they're able to speak. So it's actually become a fad for hearing people to teach their children sign language. And kids are able to communicate, I'm hungry, milk, keys, hat, whatever they're into, which I think is phenomenal for hearing parents, because that part of your brain actually develops before you're able to communicate yourself verbally. And it's also great for people who are nonverbal or autistic or American Sign Language. I'll let Delbert or Jevon answer this one, but it's one of the fastest growing languages that people have become interested in taking at school. And so I think we're going to see a lot more content with deaf characters.
I have several hearing friends.
This is Delbert. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
I would just like to add that there's a lot of children's content out there for preschool age children and young people and young children. And so I'm thinking about deaf children, and that there hasn't been any research done on deaf children yet, because closed captioning is not something that young deaf children can use for access. So I love the idea of including more sign language in children's programming, because deaf children deserve education. Deaf children deserve entertainment just like anyone else does. And so Jevon and I, when we grew up in our era, we watched television without closed captioning, and we couldn't understand anything that was going on. And so now we had to imagine with each other what was going on these TV shows we were watching as a kid. And so now it's a big improvement, because we want to make this improvement based on our experience and the experience of other deaf adults, but we just want more content for deaf kids out there, period.
And here's a question from Samantha. Sure.
Mind if I interject? Okay. Again, to piggyback on what Jess was saying, many parents are teaching their children how to sign or are ingratiating that in raising their children. That increases the modalities of how these children communicate. Even my oldest son, he started learning sign at 5 months old. 5 months. So people become, in the greater society, become more fascinated to how they can ingratiate what we take, for granted as being our culture, into the American culture. And that's what I want to see in the future, is us inspiring people to communicate more multilingually.
And this is Delbert. It's just another way of communication, period. It's just another language.
I love that. I love all of this discussion we've just had. I think it's, the show is, making big strides for the deaf community. We've talked a lot about representation in media, and I think it's such an important discussion to have. And yeah, I love everything that's been said. So now our last question is from Samantha. Did needing to include ASL interpreters affect the budget of the show? And I think, this would be a question for Johanna.
I'll take this one. Well, I would just say, so when you're making any kind of show, let's just say when you're making an animated show, you have your big budget. And by the way, I am not a line producer, so I'm not the person who holds the little purse strings, but I can speak about this. In making any kind of show, you have your priorities, your budgets, right? So our show happens to be a musical. We have dance sequences. We have a character who communicates with ASL. yes, those are all things that we, the people who work with us are our consultants. I'm sure they would do it for free, but we choose to pay them. No, everybody needs to be paid for their experience and what they bring to the table. So I don't know that it makes it any more expensive. It just is a given fact of this show. We have a certain number of animators, we have a certain number of directors. It just is another, we call it a line item in the budget. So, and for us, we have a lot of priorities in this show. We wanted the ASL to, there's really just actually wasn't an option not to have this team of consultants, and also not to spend a lot of time and energy on the animation, making sure that it was accurate, that the ASL was done accurately. So it really just comes down to, do you want to make the show right? And you want to make a great piece of entertainment that is accurate as well. So, so my answer is, I guess, I guess it did, but it's all for, it's all part of producing something, is you decide what your priorities are. And our priorities were that this be a really high quality show.
I think it's beautiful what Johanna said, and Delbert more or less is the expert on this, but quickly I'll say, if you have an event, you should just automatically have a wheelchair ramp so that people in wheelchairs can get into the event. If you have an event, you should think about having an ASL interpreter, because there's millions of deaf people who might be interested in the information being provided at that event. And I think during COVID especially, we saw a lot more access to ASL, in that as the governors of every state around the country were giving this integral information, there was an ASL interpreter next to them. Remarkably, the White House was the only place not to do this, but almost, I think, all 50 states did. And so I think whether you're creating content or whether you're producing a live event, I think, like Johanna mentioned, the line item for accessibility is relatively new, but it just kind of needs to become automatic, or as Delbert says, one day we won't need to have consultants on any type of disability, because there will just be automatic access provided and a consideration for millions of people who need this type of access. And so I'll let Delbert chime in from there. But I think I look at ASL interpreting or access as just like when you get a letter in the mail and they include every major language on an official document, and for many years they did not. But I think American Sign Language is a linguistic minority, but there's millions of people that use that language. So I think, just having access to it should be a given, just like we use any other language that millions of people communicate through in any official document or anything where you want to make it available to them. And I'll let Delbert chime in, because I'm sure he's much more articulate than I am. This is Delbert speaking. So as someone who has seen a lot of various high and low budget films and TV projects, there's a line item for almost everything. Some are small line items, and very small roles often have a line item. And so I love what Johanna said, is it's just like, if you have a scene with dancing, then you should have a dancer as a dance consultant in there. If you have stunts, then you need a stunt coordinator. And that's a line item. And one challenge that I've noticed is sometimes people who create those budgets sometimes don't know where to put interpreters or where to put ASL consultants. And from my experience, I've seen that quite often. But that problem is, with increased awareness, they can begin to add this budget line item, and it has its place. And I think more and more deaf actors and deaf filmmakers that are working with Hollywood, there'll be a lot less confusion and there'll be more understanding moving forward. And this is Justin. Delbert just reminded me of something really funny, is I've worked on set before, and I'm usually miscellaneous as an ASL interpreter. And so on one set, it was animal handlers, animals, and then ASL, because AN is higher than AS. And so the deaf talent I was working with was just making fun of me throughout this whole shoot. He's like, "You're even lower on the the chain than the dogs and the animal trainers." And sometimes when I've been paid, it's been for like as a stylist or a groomer. Like they're trying to find where it can fit in, you know. So it's kind of like amazing that they're like, you know, I get something that's like you know, like I'm wardrobe, I'm putting clothes on the deaf person, but actually I'm just interpreting for what they're saying. I'm not their hairstylist.
Well, thank you all so much for speaking with me today. Johanna Stein, TJ Sullivan, Justin Maurer, Delbert Whetter, and Jevon Whetter. Jevon Whetter. It is such a pleasure to hear your perspectives, and I certainly learned so much from listening to you. It's been such a rewarding discussion, you know, discussing representation, discussing what went behind this show, some fun moments. Like we just ended on quite an interesting story from Justin. Madagascar A Little Wild is streaming now on Hulu and Peacock, so folks, be sure to check it out. They have an amazing team, and you're going to get to see an awesome episode, so definitely go and check the whole thing out on Hulu and Peacock. And thank you so much to Kids First and the University of Hawaii at Manoa Outreach College for organizing today's interview and the entire festival. And thank you for participating. I'm Eshaan M from Kids First. Mahalo.